Hi, today we're going to be talking about how we determine an author's message. You should have read the story from The Story of My Life. In this story, it talks about Helen Keller and her experiences with her teacher, Anne Sullivan. We've learned that authors write for a specific purpose. They want to share a message with the reader. We learned earlier in the year that authors do everything with intention. Some authors might come right out and tell you their message in a clear statement, such as slow and steady wins the race. But other authors will just leave clues in their writing, and you have to infer what the author's purpose is. In order to make inferences, we know we use clues from the text. These clues might come in the character's words, the character's actions. They might come in the events that happen in the story, maybe even through the setting, the structure of the piece, and the language that the author uses. In From the Story of My Life, Helen Keller writes about the moment she understood that the objects and people around her had names. Take a minute, and I want you to think about what it must have been like to be deaf and blind and have no way to speak. How can you learn? This reminds me a lot of the text that we've been reading in class, Out of My Mind. She had to find another way to communicate. Here to the left, you see American Sign Language. In the story that you read about Helen Keller, Anne Sullivan, her teacher, used sign language by making the symbols that spelled out the words in Keller's hand while she was touching something. In paragraphs 3, 4, and 5 of the text, Keller describes the process that was taken by her teacher, and then the aha moment of discovery when she connected the water that she was touching with the symbols her teacher was making in her hand. Let's go ahead and reread paragraphs 3, 4, and 5. One day, while I was playing with my new doll, Miss Sullivan put my big rag doll into my lap, also spelled D-O-L-L, and tried to make me understand that D-O-L-L applied to both. Earlier in the day, we had a tussle over the words M-U-G and W-A-T-E-R. Miss Sullivan had tried to impress it upon me that M-U-G is mug and that W-A-T-E-R is water, but I persisted in confounding the two. In despair, she had dropped the subject for the time, only to renew it at the first opportunity. I became impatient at her repeated attempts, and seizing the new doll, I dashed it upon the floor. I was keenly delighted when I felt the fragments of the broken doll at my feet. Neither sorrow nor regret followed my passionate outburst. I had not loved the doll. In the still, dark world in which I lived, there was no strong sentiment or tenderness. I felt my teacher sweep the fragments to one side of the hearth, and I had the sense of satisfaction that the cause of my discomfort was removed. She brought me my hat, and I knew I was going out into the warm sunshine. This thought, if a wordless sensation might be called a thought, made me hop and skip with pleasure. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of a returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that in time could be swept away. I left the well house eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. That was because I saw everything with the strange new sight that had come to me. On entering the door, I remembered the doll I had broken. I felt my way to the hearth and picked up the pieces. I tried vainly to put them together. Then my eyes filled with tears. I realized what I had done, and for the first time, I felt repentance and sorrow. In this part of the text, Keller uses language skillfully to help us understand how important that moment was to her. When we want to analyze language, we look at the character's actions and the character's words, and also how the author uses language to help us understand their purpose. To do this now, we're going to complete a graphic organizer. Here is a picture of Helen learning sign language with her teacher, Anne Sullivan. Let's take a look at the graphic organizer that you'll be using for today's assignment. Notice that the graphic organizer is broken up into the various paragraphs that we just read, paragraphs 3, 4, and 5. The next column is where you're going to list details from the text. This might be language, descriptions, changes in the situation, or direct statements. And then the last column is what does this make me think about? This is where you're making an inference. So when we think about this in terms of inferring, the left column is the details from the text, that's the text evidence. You're going to add that to your schema, your background knowledge, and then in that right column is where you're making your inference. Notice that the first part of this, paragraph 3, is done for you as a model. It lists language, descriptions, changes in situations, and some direct statements from paragraph 3. Then the next column, it tells what those clues make us think as the reader. You will do the same for paragraphs 4 and 5. Let's take a look at the paragraph 3 example. In one part, it said MUG is mug and WATER is water. We notice that there's a disconnect here between the letters that Miss Sullivan makes in Helen's hand. At this point in the story, Helen doesn't understand that the letters make words and the words mean something. It doesn't happen until later in the text that she figures that out. In the middle, she uses words like despair and impatient, seizing, dashed, fragments, broken, sorrow, regret, still, dark world, and discomfort. When we look at these words that are used in the text, all of these words come together to create the tone of this piece. It really is a tone of sadness and darkness. When we think about what these words mean, we can understand that this is how Helen was feeling. At the very end, she talks about how she's hopping and skipping with pleasure. So these words are in direct contrast between the words that we saw above, with it being still and dark, and then now she's going outside into the sunshine. And that, after that point, is where we have the change in the next paragraph. There's a character change, there's also a change in tone. At the beginning of the story, it's very dark, it's sad, she doesn't feel very emotional, and later in the story is when she has that character change, when she comes to that new understanding, and then a whole new world is open to her, and it's such a lift in the tone. Go ahead now and open up your assignment and continue working on paragraphs 4 and 5. Once you've analyzed the language and details in all of those paragraphs, at the bottom you will need to think about what Keller thinks about overcoming obstacles, and you'll add your thinking to the bottom of the graphic organizer.